You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your optimistically choosing host, Abraham.
And I am your multiple pathways host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do, sometimes the choices that they make or don't make, and with the things that influence those choices, and economics in a way, maybe a little bit of math sprinkled in there, but just generally human psychology. That's where you find yourselves if you're joining us for the first time. Welcome. Happy to have you here. And this episode comes out on June 28th, and we've got some holidays to recognize that this comes out. So just take a minute to celebrate the fact that we're wrapping up Pride Month here, but it's Pride Month, so happy about that. Happy Pride Month.
Yeah, still a big deal. Big supporters of that, still like that.
Yep.
It's also National Paul Bunyan Day.
It's very American.
Very specific. Yes.
Blue ox, jumping down trees.
Did he give us the Appalachians or did he give us the Rockies? Which mountain was he supposed to give us? Mountain range.
I would guess the Appalachians. I don't remember now.
I feel like Paul Bunyan feels like an Appalachian. I know that's a whole thing. So maybe one day we'll have to dive into that, but...
Okay. Also gave us those things in the bottom of your feet called bunions.
Thanks. Thanks, guy.
It's National Insurance Awareness Day, which actually kind of loosely ties into our topic for today in the sense that it is a risk thing that you pay money toward, and then you are basically buying nothing.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fair. It's also International Body Piercing Day, so that's fun.
Yeah. I've got lots of body piercings myself. I used to have more. Taken a bunch of them out as I've gotten old.
I took mine out too. I had my nose pierced several times.
Okay. I had nose, lip, tongue. All those are gone. A couple ear piercings, all that. So
we're getting old.
Yeah, it just happens. Get fun, poke holes in yourself when you're young, I guess. At least that's what we did. It is National Ceviche Day, which calling it national in the United States sounds weird, but that's what it said. So National Ceviche Day.
I guess that's a whole thing. It's also Happy Hearts Hugs Day.
I had to look this one up. This one is kind of interesting.
That sounds nice.
It's meant to, as far as I can tell from the description of this, communicate a high level of like love and compassion and respect for someone at a distance. Like someone you can't just say this to, like send them a text or a message on social media or something like that and write the soppy, like heartwarming thing you've been thinking of. Like, Shane, I so appreciate you being here with me. I'm really lucky to have you as my co-host. You're a really swell fella. And I just really appreciate you.
It's about time.
So that was a happy heart hug, I think.
That was so sweet. I love that. Yeah, that sounds very wholesome. It's like the whole idea of like give people their flowers before they pass,
Yeah, exactly. That's I like that a lot. Couple of quick housekeeping things. The podcast awards are coming out. You can follow them by going to facebook.com/group/podcast awards or twitter.com/podcast awards, or you can just drop your Twitter account because Twitter sucks.
Yep.
You're looking for the hashtag PCA23, PCA standing for Podcast Awards, and 23 being the year 2023. Starting July 1st, you can go to podcastawards.com to nominate Why We Do What We Do for best podcast in whatever category. So you should go do that thing if you're interested in doing that. If you're also interested in supporting us, you can do so in other ways. You can pick up some merch at our store. You can follow us. You can like us. You can leave us a rating and review. You can also join us on Patreon, where you get access to all kinds of behind-the-scenes goodies. And, of course, you can create a theory of decision-making called Why We Do What We Do, which would be a really good name for a theory, if you think about it. Right?
I like that. That's actually like very spot on. That's why we named the podcast what we named it.
Exactly. Yes. We are a theory in a manner of speaking, I guess. And I'll talk more about the ways that you can support us at the end of this discussion today. And before we move on, as I mentioned, we have these people on Patreon. We appreciate them. They're the best. You can join the list of people that we appreciate and call the best by going over there. And if we can reach a goal of 15 Patreon members by the end of June, we're going to do a virtual hangout with y'all. And if we don't, then maybe we'll just extend that offer out a little bit further. but we want to hang out with you. So come join us over on Patreon. We got tiers as low as $1. If you can swing $1 a month, it helps us out, helps you out, because then you get behind the scenes extra stuff. So yeah, that's what we have going on in the background here. Are we ready to talk about our topic today?
Yeah, let's dive in. I think this is an interesting one.
Yeah, and actually I think it'll be a shorter-ish one. This is a Psych 101 one day of class replacement episode, maybe. Like you skip the day on behavioral economics, and this will cover a chunk of that. Or maybe as a supplement, if that's your thing. I don't know if psychology professors would agree with that assessment of this, but we're going to talk about behavior economics thing. And before we start, I'm going to ask you, Shane, would you rather take a drug that has a 90% success rate or a drug that has a 10% failure rate?
So do I get to ask any questions about this?
No.
Then yes.
Great. What was your question?
I was going to say, what drug?
Let's say like a migraine drug.
I would go with the 90% success rate. That sounds nice.
Naturally. I think that's a good choice. That's a good choice.
Yeah.
We're going to talk more about how I just set up that question as we get into our topic today. But actually, let's give some more background. I mean, you probably saw it in the title of this episode. Maybe you read the description of this, but let's get into a little background because we're going to get to what it's called and why that matters. But let's just unpack a little bit of where we're coming from here.
Yes. So, spoiler alert. For all of life and the secrets of psychology, everything we do in the context of what we have learned, how we were raised, our current circumstances, and the combination of our biology. And of course, we believe this because so far it is true for everything we have ever done, and it is never not true for something anyone has ever done. Basically, what we're talking about today is this idea of prospect theory.
Yes. We're going to be talking about this idea of choices. That's something that's actually going to come up in subsequent episodes as well. And we've talked about a little bit in the past, but there's this idea of choices. This is something that has deeply intrigued a lot of people for a long time. Choices are treated as some sort of magical other behavior that is unique among behaviors and worthy of discussion as its own sort of entity. So that's why we feel like we need to unpack this a little bit. But because so much attention has been given to the idea of choices, there's a lot of like theories and hypotheses and laws named or specifically to address the choices that people make. And so that's one of the things we're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, I think choices are really fascinating, but also I don't think they're quite as complex as people make it out to be.
Yeah, well, I also don't think that they represent a unique segment of human behavior. Like, I don't think it stands out as being fundamentally different in process, form, or any other feature of things that humans do personally. And it'll be worth getting into what choosing means and what choices are at some point. But for now, let's get into another landmark theory about how people make choices. And this has largely been studying in a field called behavioral economics.
Ah, yes. You know, I'd love me some economics. Now, a 1995 study by Madvek, Maddie, and Gilovich reported that Olympic bronze medal winners appeared to be happier than silver medal winners. The narratives hypothesized that the silver medal winners see their outcome as missing their chance at gold, as the only other possible outcome, whereas the bronze medalists see their outcome as, I won a medal, as compared to winning not at all. Meaning the silver medalists saw their medal as a loss by comparing upward, and the bronze medalists saw their award as gain by comparing it downward to lower rankings. So basically, silver medalists were bummed they didn't get the gold. Bronze medalists were just happy to be there.
Exactly right. Yeah. There's this whole sort of perspective here and how you frame it, how you think of it, what you sort of mean.
Yeah.
So this is all situated inside of this idea of choice and how people value a particular outcome. And this is the idea of risk versus reward and gain versus loss. And so those are the sort of balancing quadrants of values we're going to bring to talking about this theory and understanding choice making.
And one of the most common theories to summarize data on this choice research is called prospect theory by Kahneman and Tversky in 1979. This is also called the loss aversion theory. So you might have heard it, either the prospect theory or the loss aversion theory. Either one is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I was sort of trying to dig through the history, and the first citations we found suggested that this was developed in 1973, but virtually everyone cited the publication as being 1979 for prospect theory. So I'm thinking maybe it was sort of proposed and then experimentally walked out over the next few years and then published in 1979. But this theory was created in part to help understand why people make what you might call suboptimal choices and how they use heuristics or shortcuts to evaluate the relative worth of an outcome when they're making choices.
Yeah. So I think it's probably worth taking some time to let's break this down. Let's kind of like unpack this. Let's look at every component. And we're going to start with understanding what the problem is that prospect theory is trying to solve. One way of understanding people's choices is that they will make the best possible choice or the best choice for their circumstance. So let's say we're going to the DMV. Short aside, DMV in the US is rough, horrible. I think one time I had to wait like 3 hours just to get my daughter the paperwork to be able to get her permit, her driving permit. It's a mess. And that was a short wait.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, DMV is, I mean, we use it almost synonymously to describe drowning in a sea of bureaucracy where nothing gets done and the simplest task is like the most labor intensive thing you can imagine.
Yeah.
That to me is how I talk about the DMV. I'm like, pretty much if you want to compare anything that is like a boring, unnecessarily complicated task, you compare it to the DMV. At least that's how I use it.
Yeah, and I mean, and just to kind of give you like a little bit of insight on the hellscape that is Florida, the DMV that was in our town had its own standalone building, and the government cut their funding in Florida and was like, you don't need a building. So they moved them to a like pretty much an abandoned mall in South Daytona, Florida, to the point where like the person that owns the mall does not run the AC inside the mall. So it's like a balmy, like 95 degrees inside the mall. And then every unit has its own, like they run their own AC and stuff like that. It's a miserable experience because you have to wait in line. It's for the entire county. You have to wait in line outside in the mall because there's no room inside the DMV. It is absurd.
Wow. That's horrible.
Yeah, it's horrible. So basically what we're saying is you don't know if you're going to be there for 5 minutes or 5 hours. So you think perhaps you should bring your computer so you can do some work while you wait. And this means you'll probably need a charger and you'll have to find a seat, buy an outlet. Plus you're holding on to it while you're waiting in line. So you have to decide, do you bring the laptop or do you not bring the laptop? That is a choice in a kind of terrible circumstance.
And there's sort of 3 dimensions to your problem of deciding whether you bring a laptop. You have 1, the outcomes. You're either encumbered or unencumbered, meaning you have your laptop or you're carrying it around or you don't. And then you're either bored or you're productive. So you either have something to do or you don't have something to do. So that's dimension 1. Dimension 2 is the states, and the state is just the thing that's outside of your control. Like, are there long lines or short lines? Quick side note, almost never short lines. That would be a rare day.
Yes.
So assume that there are long lines, but maybe you get lucky, maybe they're short lines. And then, so that's the states. And the third dimension here is the choices that you make. You either bring the laptop or you don't bring the laptop. And so that's sort of a way to frame how decision-making might occur in this scenario.
Right. And so in this scenario, you essentially have 4 basic possible outcomes. 1, you bring the laptop and don't need it because you efficiently complete your visit in only a few minutes and unnecessarily carried your stuff with you. 2, you bring the laptop and need it because the lines are long and your visit takes hours. 3, you don't bring the laptop and wait for hours without getting anything done. Or 4, you don't bring the laptop and the lines are quick and you are in and out within minutes, unencumbered by a laptop. As you can see, the combination of the things that come up, I mean, there's all sorts of other variables that might come into play, but those are generally your 4 basic outcomes.
Yeah, and this is really just situated to help enumerate a way that you might understand decision making. And so the idea that you're essentially trying to maximize your possible outcome here is kind of wrapped up in something that's very old called expected utility hypothesis. And expected utility posits that rational decision makers will always make the choice that has the most utility or the best outcome for them. The implication of this is that if there are 2 choices that have identical outcomes, that they'll be selected evenly and treated as if they are even outcomes. For instance, if you were to find a $5 bill or find 2 $5 bills and then lose one, you would have a net gain of $5 either way. So you wouldn't have a preference over which scenario you were in. You'd end up with $5. Right. That's sort of how that theory works out. But in reality, most people prefer the situation where you gain $5 as opposed to the one in where you gain $10 but lose 5 of those dollars. And so this is kind of thought of as being this irrational thinking because the outcomes are the same, but people would nevertheless choose the situation where they only gained and had no losses at all.
So this was the big idea of prospect theory, that people weigh losses and gains differently and risks and rewards differently when making choices. And with that being said, we're going to go ahead and give you some ads so that you can make some choices.
So we've been talking about this idea of choices and now getting into what prospect theory tries to do in relation to what was this expected utility hypothesis. I actually saw it referred to as expected utility theory as well, but I think theory is maybe not as accurate given the amount of data that there are about this. But anyway, the idea from prospect theory is that humans are loss averse, meaning that they are more likely to avoid losses than they are to seek gains. Now, apparently, this is a groundbreaking discovery at the time, particularly because the prevailing wisdom was that people didn't matter, that they would it based on utility alone and not the circumstances around it. And specifically, what they sort of found in their study was that losses are around 1.5 to 2 times more impactful than gains, meaning that if for example, would just link that to money, you'd have to gain $15 to $20 for every $10 lost to feel like there was an even experience in terms of whether you are okay with the loss or prefer the gain.
Right. So another example of this might be investing in a stock that gained $100 versus one that gained $200 then lost $100. So people are more likely to choose the stock that only gained 100 as opposed to the stock that gained 200 and lost 100 because people don't like losing.
Now, I should have started this episode with a trigger warning that we are going to be talking about math, and we've already thrown a lot of numbers at you, but there's more math to come. So
prepare yourself.
Yeah, prepare yourself. I mean, it's really not complicated. We're not really talking through formulas or anything. It's just that we're going to be talking about things relevant to math.
Yeah.
Anyway, related to that, there are a couple of fun things in math to understand in prospect theory. And so this is kind of where we get to the meat of it, if you will. If you can imagine a matrix, and for those of you who are not really conjuring what I mean by this is just a grid with an X and Y axis running through the middle, where the top and right represent positive values, and the left and bottom quarters represent negative values. You have sort of 4 grids arranged around these axes, if you will,
right,
that run through the middle. In this case, the x-axis, or the horizontal one, often represents values or money, but it could be any choice, really. And then the vertical axis represents utility, or the outcome there. And if you were to plot the expectations for human choice according to the expected utility hypothesis, it'd basically be a straight line that went from a diagonal line, but straight. It wouldn't be curved. It would start at the bottom left quadrant, and it would slope straight up to the top right quadrant, essentially meaning that the more it was worth, the more it had utility and a linear, even projection from across.
That's according to that theory, but prospect theory instead suggests an asymmetrical relation to choice. Graphically, there's a steep convex curve in the bottom left quadrant. And this means that as the value of choice increases, the utility of that choice barely changes until the value reaches nearly 0 or positive.
And then once the line crosses the 0, it forms a convex curve. And this means that immediately after the positive benefit is achieved, the relative value has a quick increase, but not by a lot, and then it kind of flattens out even as the value continues to increase. The utility does not. So you get sort of what looks kind of like an S on the graph, where the middle of the S intersects the 0. It sort of is like the relative utility of it doesn't change very much until you get to 0. Then it slopes up quickly and hits 0, passes through 0, and continues just to accelerate, and then starts to flatten out and just sort of forms a relatively straight line at a relatively low value too. It doesn't even get up to the top part of it. The asymptote there is kind of low. And so basically saying that the negative choices are felt more impactfully than the positive choices. You don't start to see a switch in that choice until it reaches at least net 0.
Right. I was just thinking about this, and we were kind of talking about this math. It's been, I don't know, it's been probably 20 years, maybe even 25 years since I've been in any sort of algebra class that would mention some of these terms.
Wow.
Abraham, can you tell me what an asymptote is?
Yeah, an asymptote is in a curved line where the line approaches. It's usually as you stretch out in time, the value over the line approaches so close to 0 that it basically stays relatively parallel with 0. But yeah, very, very technically and specifically, it's a line that continually approaches a given curve, but does not actually meet that curve at any finite distance. And so it's sort of you see this in hyperbolic curves a lot. As the curve sort of slopes down toward the x-axis, it'll get really close to it, and it'll run what looks fairly parallel to it. And it's possible that they'd meet at some point, it actually reach 0, but it also might just never reach 0 and just continue on that way indefinitely.
Yeah, it's kind of like that sibling that's always I'm not touching you, but they're really, 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 really close.
Yes, that's exactly it.
All right. Thank you for that lesson. All right, so at this point, however, you have to consider what 0 is on a number line, meaning what is your starting position when we talk about this? And the starting place by which you determine whether an outcome tends toward the positive or negative is called the reference point in prospect theory. Now, starting with a lot means that you have a lot more to lose and are more avoidant of risk. Starting with very little means you have little to lose and a lot more to gain and are more risky in making choices. So, you have a lot, you don't want to take any risks. You have a little bit, you're more likely to take risks.
Right, because your potential for gain seems greater, because even if you were to gamble on some activity or outcome, what you could lose is not that much relative to where you're at.
Right.
So in keeping with a scientific behavioral point of view, Kahneman and Tversky astutely noted that each person's reference point is influenced by their past and present circumstances, culture, and preferences, and that it can change over time as people learn and change, which I think was extremely forward thinking for people at that time, and particularly for behavioral economists.
Yeah, this was, what year? This was 1995?
Well, no, this one's more the 1979, although
this one's, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they continued to, like, refine and develop prospect theory, and there was, like, another seminal paper of theirs in, I want to say, 1992, but they published on this a lot, and it really did shape behavioral economics.
Yeah, good for them. I mean, I'm glad they were ahead of the curve on that.
Yeah.
You know, pun intended. Now, this might be thought of as the pleasure from a gained reward is less intense than the pain of a lost reward, even if the outcomes are tangibly, quantitatively the same.
Yeah.
So you might be going, well, like, it feels better to gain than it would be to lose, even though I end up at the same space.
Yeah, and I think that they would probably frame it as, like, gaining $10 does not feel as good as losing $10 feels bad,
right,
if that makes sense.
Yes.
So the penny saved is a penny earned sort of mentality, I think, sort of applies here.
Sure.
As opposed to spending it. Now, this also does apply to the probability of an award, some outcome. People tend to prefer more probable outcomes to less probable ones when they're talking about gains. And this is called risk aversion, which is, again, they tend to prefer smaller outcomes that are more guaranteed to riskier outcomes that might be larger.
Now, alternatively and reciprocally, people prefer a less certain unfavorable outcome to a more certain unfavorable outcome. So essentially, loss of a reward is worse if the loss is guaranteed as opposed to the unknown. If you do something illegal, it is more probable that you will get fined. But if you gamble your money, it is less certain that you will lose the money, even when it is the same amount of money that you might lose. So I'm okay with gambling. I'm definitely not going to do something illegal. The outcomes, even though they're kind of the same, they're a little bit different, right? Because I know if I do something illegal, I'm going to be in trouble.
Yeah. So if it was like a $200 fine for littering or $200 lost while gambling, people are more likely to do the gambling thing than the littering thing. Littering is more certain. Gambling is, you don't know. You don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Right.
You could lose $200, but you don't know. That's maybe not the best example because there's like other social stigma that comes with littering, and there's like the confrontation of being confronted by the police, and then the actual relative certainty of being caught for littering seems pretty low.
Right.
Unless you happen to have dark skin, in which case the consequences are probably more certain, particularly in certain parts of this country, in the United States at least. So anyway, those are some considerations, but that's just, it's meant to be a hypothetical to illustrate the point, not be an exact example of how that would play out.
Right.
So anyway, the key idea from all of this then is that because people are more concerned with avoiding loss than they are with necessarily acquiring gains, there's sort of some four major implications of this. I'm going to do letters. A, people will take actions that reduce the chance of losses. B, people will avoid taking actions that could lead to losses. So those are similar, but slightly different. C, people take more risks when they're experiencing losses than when they're experiencing gains. And D, people, quote, tend to overestimate the likelihood of low probability events and overestimate the likelihood of high probability events, essentially downplaying things that are more likely to happen and not really estimating things that are less likely to happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So Kahneman and Tversky understood that how these scenarios are framed is important in understanding the choice that people will make. That is it framed as a loss or as a gain? So take the example at the beginning of the episode. Would you rather take a drug with 90% success rate or a 10% fail rate? Well, those are the exact same outcome when you do some basic math. For folks in Florida, it's the same outcome. It's the same number. It ends up being the same number.
You just have to trust us.
You just have to trust us on that. Okay. I mean, we are a form of media. So, I guess take that with what you will. But a drug that is 90% successful has, by definition, a 10% failure rate. But framing it as a loss makes it seem worse than framing it as a gain. So people are more likely to choose the former.
Right. Yeah. The 90% success rate. This brings us to the stages of decision making in prospect theory. And there's basically two stages, although they have sub-stages. The first stage is editing, and the second stage is evaluating.
Right. So in the editing stage, complex choices are mentally whittled down to use mental shortcuts to include or exclude certain information that will be used in the evaluating stage. There are also substages to editing that probably aren't worth going into great detail, but they are briefly coding, combination, segregation, cancellation, simplification, and detection, specifically detection of dominance. Now, during the editing, people may be starting with inadequate information or reject important pieces of information due to poor mental shortcuts they may be using, which could account for some of the suboptimal choices that they may make.
Yeah. And I think the names of those sort of substages kind of help, but essentially it just has to do with what information is included and excluded is sort of what those are.
Sure.
So that's the editing stage, as you mentioned. And so editing is where a lot of the heavy lifting is done, because that's where you're sort of deciding what information is relevant here. In the evaluating stage, people use the information retained in the editing stage, whatever doesn't get removed, to then weigh the potential outcomes in terms of those positive or negative results and make a decision that will maximize gains and avoid losses, although the losses are weighed more heavily than the gains.
Yes. So how the choice is presented would be predicted by prospect theory to influence what decision is made. You can see this at work in marketing, where companies tend to promote the gains made or the losses avoided. Same thing. Or similar, at least.
Yeah.
Now, although it would be funny to see an ad that was brutally honest about the losses one might experience by purchasing their product. I would love to see that.
Yeah. They're like, this isn't that good. You probably won't like it all that much. It's not really going to help you with the problem you're trying to solve. Buy our product.
Yeah, buy our product. Why bother?
So that kind of actually frames the bulk of prospect theory. It essentially is stating that people tend to weigh losses more heavily or more impactfully than they do weigh their gains, that they tend to then make choices based off their starting point, which has to do with whether they're already experiencing losses and gains, and then also has to do with the relative probability of those losses or gains. If they're riskier and low probability, or if they're more high probability and more likely outcomes. And then the preference is reversed from positive to negative, meaning preferring more certain gains to riskier ones and preferring less certain losses to more certain ones. And that pretty much sums up how it works. And now one thing that hopefully astute sort of skeptical listeners might be asking is, but what do the critics say about this? Where does this start to break down? And unfortunately, we're going to have to lean on those listen to this marketing thing. Let's see if they're brutally honest about the losses you might experience by purchasing their product.
Fingers crossed.
This is all you, ads. All right, let's unpack some criticisms of prospect theory.
I love criticisms. They're so fun.
Right.
It's kind of worth asking, is it all peaches and rainbows? Of course not. There's no perfect theory out there. There never has been. Anything that tries to account for a broad category of behaviors with a specific guideline about those behaviors is going to miss the mark with some cases. At the very least, some cases. Not all cases, but at least some cases.
Yeah. And so one criticism of prospect theory has to do with that reference point that we mentioned, that sort of like, where's your zero? From what standpoint are you evaluating what's good, what's negative, that sort of thing? And because it's so difficult to pin down, because it is in reference to all those things we mentioned, like your culture, your preferences, your learning history, it has limited application to quantitatively understanding or predicting behavior, because economists can't look at someone's starting place and quantitatively assign where they're at if it's something like your learning history. And so that's been one criticism, is it's been hard to pack into a model because it depends on something that they can't really define all that easily, because it's a somewhat nebulous concept.
Right. And now others point out that prospect theory does not adequately reflect other psychological features of decision making, such as the emotional state someone is in at the moment they have to make a choice, things like that. I mean, when we talk about this type of thing being contextual, we are talking that it is extremely contextual, and there are hundreds of variables that apply to making a single choice.
Yeah, I mean, if you can imagine someone who's really upset or is just absolutely like elated at the moment that they might choose something, that's probably going to have an impact on how that choice skews, and particularly whether they sort of self-frame it as being positive or negative.
You know how many books I bought when I was mad? None. How many when I was happy? All of them.
Then you've been happy a lot based on your your library.
I try.
Let's see here. So talking about these criticisms, the framing of questions can be arranged pretty neatly in these experiments. They ask them just that straightforward, would you prefer a drug that's 90% successful or 10% failure rate, that sort of thing. But in everyday circumstances, that's not necessarily how these setups are going to be arranged. And there's often going to be multiple competing, contradictory, or complementary frames that will occur in every decision-making step. So as you go along, it's not going to be so black and white as, is this a loss or is this a gain? It's probably going to have a lot of different references to a lot of different things competing with other things as well. And so framing is unlikely to be present to consumers in the way that it is used in the experiments that have sort of showed how in an analog prospect theory might work.
Absolutely. Now, psychologists have also suggested this model does not accurately represent the process of decision-making, even if it tends to get the outcome fairly correct. Specifically, that people do not naturally go through all of the steps and processes outlined in prospect theory. And if they do, it's probably not explicit or it's probably not very quantifiable.
Try to think for yourself, like if you were making a choice, did you sit down and go like, now I am in editing phase. What information should I include or exclude?
Right.
Like, I think the assumption is that aspect of decision-making is implicit and automatic, and probably, I think they would say, relatively unconscious. I think we're not actually trying to make those decisions. That's just sort of a way of describing in a kind of heuristic way how we are making those decisions. And so it maybe isn't capturing like what decision-making actually looks like because nobody's really going through those steps. And that actually is kind of relative to the last one here, which is that it may rely too heavily on this idea of cognitive processes without really considering sort of the more concrete observable behaviors and circumstances, contextual stimuli and variables that we can definitely measure and get a handle on that are going to be relevant to understanding how this works, which kind of leads us to a scientific behavior-based perspective on what is happening in these choice models in relation to prospect theory.
Absolutely. You know, the behaviorists in us, we have to tackle this stuff.
Have to.
The thing is we're not going to get into choice right now, but we are going to talk about this, at least elements of this from a behavioral perspective. In viewing behavior through a circumstantial point of view, we see decisions around things such as finance as being influenced by our experience and context, right? Experience, context, those things together make for certain decisions, and we're going to make decisions based on what we know.
Every time.
One way this might be easily manifested is by looking at the relative ubiquitousness, I said it, there you go, about something like prospect theory in other cultures, where the learning history about gains and losses might be different.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think about, like, one of the best ways to break a psychological theory is to ask, like, do they do that in other countries, right? Because,
yes.
Because one of the jokes about psychology is it's like the science of undergrad students in the United States.
Yeah.
And these sort of white, educated, industrialized places. That's why they call it weird.
Right.
Following the acronym of those features of the subjects who tend to make up these types of studies. And in fact, this was the case. And this was a 2011 analysis by Marshall and colleagues that found that in different countries where riskier financial decisions are considered more acceptable, people are less loss averse and less risk averse than they are as described by the study. So even if you see sort of a general tendency that looks kind of like what you see in prospect theory, the fact is that you can sort of start to pull it apart by looking at countries where they have different values, different histories, different economic circumstances, and therefore they make different choices based on a totally different situation that they're in. And then you sort of think like, so prospect theory, what it's capturing is what people tend to do in Western cultures, but that kind of means that it's almost by definition, or not by definition, but almost has to be, or like, I guess in a different way, it can't be endemic to humans generally, because we've already seen that just a simple shift in culture without trying to change anything else has people respond differently to choice-making situations.
Absolutely, 100%. And that again, that's how you break a theory. Just apply it somewhere else and see if it still works. And if it doesn't, well, you know, maybe it's contextual. So further, Whenever someone makes a decision, they learn from that decision, so people's relative evaluation of the experience of loss or risk is likely to change throughout their life as they gain experiences with losses or gains. So essentially, it's not static, and it can't be static. Your starting point is always going to move and shift, let alone your reference point is always going to move and shift, let alone all of the other variables that influence those decisions.
And to their credit, Kahneman and Tversky did point out that this was something that would change over time. But I think that sort of almost cuts out the knees from under this, and by saying essentially what people do is going to change. And I think that we would actually suggest it probably changes even more than they might predict that it would change, because I think the relative exposure to risks, losses, probability, and gains is going to shift pretty dramatically how they start making choices later in life as they get more and more experience with having to make those choices and experiencing the outcomes of those choices. And maybe they start to even out a little bit. Someone who loses a lot might start to think they might start to have the experience losses aren't so bad. I'm able to bounce back from those pretty quickly. So particularly because I'm only losing such and such amount and I can gain that same amount by doing this other thing. So it's it's worth the gamble.
Right.
And I mean, I could see that being the case. So we just know that learning history is such an important part of it. And another thing to consider here is I always like to wrap things in the context of sort of evolution and natural selection, that sort of thing. And I think that this is not a criticism of prospect theory. If anything, I think that there is some evolutionary reason to believe that there's some truth to this idea, which is that it makes some amount of sense that losing resources should be more impactful than gaining resources, in the sense that some resources are extremely important in the immediate here and now, right? So if you look at something like resources such as food, they're ephemeral. Mm-hmm. And while gaining food in a food scarce environment, so you're already sort of in a food scarce environment, when you gain that food, that provides momentary security for the near future. You've got something that's okay, this will last me today, maybe tomorrow, I've got some time here. Versus if you lose food, that is an immediate guarantee of insecurity in the near and possible long-term future.
Right.
So those threats to your security have an immediate, real, lasting impact, and that might then have there being a very natural tendency to without having to do any mental calculations, gaining things is more important because that provides immediate security for now and possibly into the future.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense from that perspective. Now, of course, the future is a concept only afforded to creatures that can organize their sense of time into a framed reference to, quote, things that happened before now, and, quote, things that that might happen after now, which, as far as we can tell, is a pretty uniquely human thing, right? It's not really something that happens. I don't see dolphins wearing wristwatches.
Yeah, and it's not that we see examples of non-human animals doing things that look like sort of planning, if you will, like burying food so they can come back to it later is something that seems like a plan for the future. But we don't. First of all, that's the circumstances in which that happen are few enough that it does seem like it's unique that we tend to even notice that it happens, because wow, look at that, they're thinking about the future. And second of all is whether they're actually thinking about it in terms of the future or instead in terms of biological imperative that is a response to simple stimulus cues in the environment. We don't know what their response is. Maybe they are planning for the future, but we know that humans do this a lot, very easily and constantly. And so even if this does appear in non-human animals, they're doing it to a different degree and not to the extent or consistency that humans do it.
Right.
So that's why we think it's sort of human. But last sort of point on here is, in sort of unpacking again this behavioral aspect of it, is there is a lot of empirical data at this point that shows that people's choices are largely, if not completely, influenced by the outcome of their previous choices, which kind of goes back to what we've already been talking about.
Right.
So it could be correct that loss is felt more severely than gains when the outcomes are the same, but whatever someone will do the next time they're making a choice will be very powerfully influenced by the outcome of the last time they made that particular choice. And we've got data for miles to back that one up. We just know that that's the case at this point.
And that makes perfect sense. Now, I feel like that goes back to Thorndike's intelligent cats, right? We learn from our experiences, right? That is literally us going through the maze and then figuring out how to go through the maze faster.
And we have an episode on Thorndike and his cats.
Those fancy cats.
We also have an episode on behavioral economics in which we interviewed Dr. Lynn Green This is episode 42, which was published February 28th, 2018. If you want to go back and check that one out, maybe worth a rerun at some point in the future.
Yeah, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. But we have more on that topic there. And then we've also got more about, we've lots of topics sort of vaguely related to choice making and that sort of thing, and more are planned. So stay tuned for those. But yeah, let's hit some take home points here.
Yeah, I think the big take-home point is it's always nice when psychologists and researchers want to put together a theory that tries to explain something. But the problem is that when you try to overgeneralize that theory, you start very easily punching holes in it. If you try to take that and apply it to every member of the species, every member of the group, any culture, especially when it comes to human behavior, if it starts falling apart, then it's not a thing that holds, or maybe it doesn't entirely capture the experience. And I think, they started to account for that when they started talking about how this will ebb and flow and change. But I don't think that they really saw the entire picture of this was probably better explained by some other theory or process.
Yeah, I think one take-home point for me, which we didn't explicitly state, but is something that I think you can sort of connect the dots with things that we described. And I don't know if we said this clearly, but this has been one of the most enduring theories in all of behavioral economics. It has proved pretty useful. They've applied it countless times and repeated it in many studies. And even though there are criticisms, it has really shaped the field of behavioral economics, and people continue to use the general idea of this and refine it. They've found a lot of ways to sort of build on it and expand it and find its parameters of limitation, as well as how it could be applied to things like world wars, like international conflict, like a whole thing that I've seen be wrapped in now with this idea of loss aversion and that sort of thing. And so what's interesting about it is as you said, this is one of the few theories that has what I would describe as a pretty behavior analytic skewing in terms of thinking about this in terms of the contextual features of someone's situation, and how that's important in understanding the choices that they'll make. And I think that's something that is pretty on board with things that I think we would see. And it has also then proved to be one of the most enduring of those theories. So yeah. I think that there's a lot of potential here to use sort of unintentionally use behavioral principles to help explain some human behaviors. And there's, we can poke some holes in that too. We simply just, we look at and find ways where we might say that this breaks down, and those are legitimate. Those are things for us to examine critically and understand what we're missing in terms of understanding the choices that people make. But that to me is sort of the big standout, is that as this is something that has continued to prove useful as a landmark in behavioral economics understanding, it is also one of the most behavioral that has come out of behavioral economics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of what it comes down to for me, is when it comes to choice and it comes to the choice making behavior, I think it's just far too complex to put into a box. I think there are too many things. There are too many things that come into play to immediately go, this is the thing, this is the theory, this is the one thing that tells me that this is everything.
And as we'll get to in a subsequent episode down the road, this also is probably better at explaining choice than some of the explicitly behavioral theories that came out about choice later.
Yes.
In my opinion.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah. So but we'll talk about that another day. Any other take-home points for you before we wrap up?
No, I think that covers it for me.
Well, if you're joining us for the first time, there's something we like to do at the end of every episode, which is give some recommendations, something that we think that you listeners could or should go out and experience for yourselves and maybe find joy in it the way that we did. But before we do that, we need to give thanks where thanks are due. And one is that I'd like to credit my team here. We have editing and production by Justin Greenhouse, writing and fact-checking by Shane, Jess, and myself, and then the people over there at Patreon. And when you join us on Patreon, you get some certain perks. You get early access to episodes, you get behind the scenes content such as unedited episodes, videos, notes, that sort of thing. And sometimes just fun little tidbits we'll post just because it's something that occurred to us that we'd like to share with people. And you only get that if you go over there and join us on Patreon. And there's various tiers, you can join at whatever level, and that just helps support us. And join for a little bit and then maybe stop, if you want to do that sort of thing. And if you do, then I'm going to say thank you. Every single episode, I'm going to thank the current list of people right now who deserve my thanks because they're wonderful, they're here, and we appreciate them. That wonderful group of people includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, the Daily BA, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, and Brian. Thank you all so much for your continued support of everything that we do.
Yes, you are the best.
Of course, thank you everyone for listening to us today. And of course, thank you, Shane, for taking time to record with me on this rare Monday morning episode.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's always fun.
We made it work. Anything that I left out or anything we need to include before we get to our recommendations?
No, I think that about covers that.
Oh yeah, go support us on Podcast Awards. All right, let's do some recommendations.
Recommendations.
All right, I am recommending the latest season of Black Mirror. I think it was season 6. It just came out, actually at the time of this recording, like 2 days ago. It came out very recently, or 3 days ago now. This is kind of one of the weirder seasons. I would say that very little of this season actually has to do with specific technology or technological advancements. It's actually the first time I've seen this level of supernatural brought to the Black Mirror season, but it has got some really, really good episodes in it. Particularly the first couple really stood out to me as being fantastic. And the rest, they're all good. But yeah, I if you're into Black Mirror, I recommend checking it out. New season out now on Netflix.
I heard that this season was pretty good, and I heard there were a couple very Stephen King-esque episodes. Like there was some episode that takes like plot points from Dead Zone, I think, or something like that, which is cool.
Okay.
So
I'm not familiar with Dead Zone, but I would definitely say there's at least 2 episodes that come to mind that seem very Stephen King-esque.
Okay, very cool. Very cool. I like it. Well, if you're recommending media, I would also like to recommend media, and that would be the book and the movie. I think people know about this, and I'm late to the game on this, so whatever. But it's The Martian by Andy Weir. So I just finished this book. It's not often that I will clear out everything in my world and just read a book and finish it. I tend to read in big chunks. So I'll read a couple hours here, a couple hours, and kind of do that. But this time I was like, you know what? I'm going to spend I think it was Saturday, just reading and reading and reading. And I think I finished the entire book that day because it was so good. I never thought I'd be super interested in reading about potato farming on Mars, but they made it work. It's done really well. I mean, if you're not familiar with The Martian, it's a story of a NASA astronaut during a Mars mission who gets stranded on Mars by himself. And the whole book is, it happens right away. The first entry is I'm stuck here. And the entire book is her trying to get him off of Mars and him problem solving how to survive on Mars with limited resources. And it's incredible. It is done so well. And the movie, also great. Matt Damon, perfect for that role. They could not have cast a better person for that role.
Yeah, I've actually gone on to say that I think this is now up there with my favorite movie of all time.
Really?
Yeah, I really, really love The Martian. It's like that and Shawshank Redemption are both competing for number 1 in my heart for my favorite movie.
I don't blame you. It's incredible. They do it. It's done so well. I was totally sucked in.
Yeah. And the book is absolutely amazing. So like I said, as the movie is already one of my favorites, the book is, I think, even better if that's possible. And so
yeah,
high recommend. Yeah, I completely second that. I wonder if I've recommended one of those on here before. Probably the movie.
I think you did the movie, but either way, now you've got the WWD stamp of approval.
Yeah, double stamp.
We need a rubber stamp for that.
We do. That's right. And I don't know if you have seen this, but the extended version of The Martian, so worth it.
Okay.
Adds in a few things from the book that were missed in sort of the standard theatrical release. So I recommend that too.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I've seen that one, but I will definitely check that out.
Cool. All right. I think that's all that we have to say about The Martian and Black Mirror, and probably all we have to say about Prospect Theory. If you'd like to correct us or give us feedback or tell us how everything that we got right and send us wonderful compliments, you can email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com. Please reach out to us on social media. We've got lots of cool stuff going on there. Happy to hear from you. The podcast handle of most places is WWD Podcast, and we'll look forward to hearing from everybody there. Is there anything that I missed or anything you'd like to add before we say goodbye, Shane?
Nope, I think that covers it.
All right, appreciate you all. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We are out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.